I'd been hiking in Maine for most of my life, but that trip with my son was the first time I ever felt something close to real fear in the woods. It was late summer, one of those humid weeks when the air feels heavy even in the shade. My son, Ethan, had just turned 16, and we'd planned a 2-day hike through a lesser-known section of trail near the northern border, deep in the thick pine forests that seemed to go on forever. We wanted quiet. That was the whole point. The more remote, the better. Most of the people we talked to had never even heard of the route we planned to take. It wasn't on the main maps anymore, just marked faintly on some old hiking forums as a discontinued service road that had faded back into nature. I'd always liked places like that, the ones that made you feel like you were walking through a piece of forgotten land. We started early in the morning, before the sun got high enough to heat the air. The first few miles were simple, a worn dirt path through thick pine and spruce. The forest floor was soft, covered in fallen needles that muffled our steps. It was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the creak of the trees shifting in the breeze. We didn't talk much, just walked. The rhythm of hiking has a way of making silence comfortable. After a couple of hours, the trail started to narrow, the brush closing in from both sides. It was obvious no one had maintained it in a long time. Branches snagged at our packs, and thick ferns grew up to our knees. Eventually, the trail just seemed to fade into the forest altogether. I pulled out the old topographic map I'd printed at home, the kind that doesn't show everything, but gives a general sense of where you are, and tried to match the contours. It looked like the old path had turned north somewhere behind us, so we cut through the undergrowth to reconnect with it. That's when we noticed how quiet everything had gotten, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The air felt still, heavier somehow. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the thickness of the woods dampening the sound. We pushed through for another 15 minutes before we came into a small clearing. It wasn't much, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by tall spruce and birch. At first glance, it looked natural, but then we saw it. Off to one side, half hidden behind some brush, was a small camp. It was primitive, a blue tarp stretched between two trees, a few cooking tins on a flat rock, and a small ring of stones that had clearly been used as a fire pit. The ashes inside were black and fresh. I remember crouching down and touching one of the charred pieces of wood, and it crumbled under my glove, still warm. That stopped me cold. We hadn't seen a single person all day. No boot prints, no tire marks, no voices. The forest was so thick and remote it didn't even seem likely someone would camp here by accident. Whoever it was, they had been here very recently, maybe even within the hour. The tarp was tied neatly, the corners pulled tight, and under it was a bed of pine needles shaped into a sleeping mat. Next to it, there were some old cans, one half-crushed, another still sealed. A pair of worn boots sat beside a tree, and next to them was a dull hatchet buried in a stump. Everything was organized in a way that didn't look abandoned, it looked lived in. My first thought was that we'd stumbled onto someone's off-grid camp, maybe a hunter or someone living rough in the woods. But the more I looked around, the stranger it felt. There were no food wrappers scattered around, no smell of cooking, no sign of trash. It was clean, deliberate, someone who knew what they were doing. I stood there for a moment, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching us. Nothing moved, no sound except the faint breeze rattling the tarp. My stomach tightened. I motioned to Ethan, and we quietly backed away from the clearing. Neither of us spoke. It wasn't panic, not yet. Just a strong instinct that we shouldn't be there. We walked fast, trying not to make noise, stepping over fallen branches and through the thick brush until the camp disappeared behind the trees. The rest of the hike that day felt different. Every noise made me turn my head. The snap of a twig somewhere behind us, the flutter of leaves overhead. All of it felt louder, sharper. I kept glancing back down the trail, half expecting to see someone following. But there was never anyone there. We made camp near a small stream a few miles away, setting up our tent on a flat patch of ground. The sun was already low, bleeding through the trees in orange light. I tried to push the thought of that camp out of my mind, but it stuck with me. The warmth of the ashes, the stillness around it. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to every sound outside the tent, every gust of wind and creak of a branch. Nothing happened, but I felt watched all the same. The next morning, we packed up quickly and headed back toward the trailhead. The air was cool, mist rising off the forest floor, and everything looked calm again, almost peaceful. When we finally reached the car, I felt a sense of relief that's hard to explain, like crossing an invisible boundary back into safety. Before we left the area, we stopped by the small ranger station near the highway. The ranger there was older, weathered-looking, the kind of man who had probably spent his entire life in the woods. I mentioned almost casually what we'd found, the camp, the fire pit, the still warm ashes. I expected him to shrug it off, maybe say it was just a hunter or a backpacker. Instead, he frowned. He didn't say much, just nodded and said they'd check it out when they could. Then he told us something that stuck with me, that sometimes people live out there for years, completely off the grid. Some are squatters, some are fugitives avoiding law enforcement, and some are just people who've decided they don't want to be found. He said they move often, especially when hikers stumble onto their camps. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. The idea that someone could live out there unseen, hidden in the same forest where we just walked. Maybe even watching us that day made my skin crawl. A week later, I got a call from the ranger. He said they'd gone out to where we described and found the camp. It was empty. Everything, the tarp, the cans, the boots, even the hatchet was gone. The only thing left was a single piece of paper pinned to a tree with a small nail. On it, written in large, uneven letters, was a message. "You shouldn't have come here." He didn't have much more to say after that. He told me they searched the area but found no sign of anyone. No tracks, no gear, nothing. Whoever it was had packed up and vanished completely. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the moment we stood in that clearing, the way the ashes felt warm against my glove, the strange silence that surrounded us. It wasn't just the threat in the note that bothered me. It was the fact that someone had been there, watching or listening, and chose to leave that message behind. I still hike, but not like I used to. I stay on marked trails now, places where I know other people go. Whenever I see a patch of open ground or something that looks like an old campsite, I move on quickly. I think about that camp sometimes, who it belonged to, how long they'd lived there, and where they went afterward. Maine's forests are big enough that someone could disappear in them completely if they wanted to. I learned that day that you never really know what's hiding just out of sight, beyond the trees. And every time I step into the woods now, there's a part of me that still expects to see that same clearing again. Empty, silent, waiting, with a message pinned somewhere nearby, reminding me that some places aren't meant to be found. It was the summer after my sophomore year of college when a few friends and I decided to go hiking in the Smoky Mountains. We'd been talking about it for months. A weekend of camping, hiking, and just being away from everything. Classes had been stressful, and everyone needed a break. There were 5 of us in total, me, 2 guys I roomed with, and 2 friends from another dorm. We weren't professional hikers by any means, but we'd been on enough trails before to know what we were doing. We picked a moderately difficult trail that wound through dense woods and climbed gradually toward a ridge with a view of the valley below. It was supposed to be a day hike, nothing more. We packed light. Some snacks, water, a small first aid kit, and rain jackets just in case. That day started out hot and humid, the kind of air that makes everything feel heavy even before you start moving. The trees in the Smokies were thick and full, their branches drooping under layers of green. Every step deeper into the trail felt like walking into another world, one where everything was quieter, softer, more still. We walked single file most of the time, the dirt path narrow and uneven. You could hear the crunch of dry leaves under our boots and the steady rhythm of breathing as the trail began to incline. We stopped often to drink water and rest, mostly because one of the guys, Mark, had heavier boots and kept saying they were rubbing his ankles raw. He was always the slowest, but none of us minded much. We weren't in a hurry. We joked around a little, took pictures of moss-covered rocks, and admired the way light filtered through the trees. At one point, I remember standing still and just listening, hearing the faint sound of a creek somewhere below us, the distant call of a bird I couldn't name, and the constant hum of insects that never seemed to stop. Around mid-afternoon, the trail split into two paths. The main one continued uphill, while a smaller one curved sharply to the right and seemed to drop down slightly before disappearing around a bend. We stopped there for a minute to check the map, making sure we were going the right way. That was when Mark said he needed to retie his boot. He stepped off to the side of the trail, near a patch of brush and a fallen log, and told us to go ahead, he'd catch up. It didn't seem like a big deal. He was only a few feet behind us, and the trail was quiet and easy to follow. We figured we'd walk slowly until he caught up again. I remember glancing back once and seeing him crouched down, bent over his boot, his pack resting on the ground beside him. The next time I looked back, he wasn't there. I didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe he'd already started walking and was hidden behind the curve of the trail. But when we reached the intersection where the two paths met again, a point maybe 50 yards ahead, he still wasn't in sight. We waited, then we waited longer. A few minutes turned into 10. The woods were completely silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I called out his name once, expecting to hear his voice echo back or footsteps crunching toward us. Nothing. No movement, no sound. It was strange because sound carried well there. If someone was even 30 feet away, you could usually hear them moving through the underbrush. But it was just stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only living thing around. We decided to walk back to where we'd last seen him. His footprints were still visible in the dirt near the fallen log, and the area looked untouched. His pack wasn't there anymore. We figured he must have already gone ahead somehow, maybe taken the wrong turn at the intersection without realizing it. We followed both paths for a few minutes each, but there was no sign of him. It was starting to feel wrong, like something had shifted, but we couldn't see what. By the time the sun began to dip lower, we knew we had to turn back. The Smoky Mountains are not a place you want to be wandering after dark, especially not off the main trail. We kept hoping he'd come walking toward us any moment, maybe laughing about how he'd taken the wrong turn or stopped to look at something. But the trail stayed empty. When we reached the parking lot hours later, his car was still there. That night, we reported him missing. Rangers and volunteers came out the next morning, and the search started early. They brought dogs, drones, and thermal cameras. We stayed around to help for as long as we could, combing through sections of the woods in grids, calling his name until our voices went hoarse. The terrain there is rugged, steep slopes, loose soil, fallen trees that create barriers you have to climb over. It's easy to get turned around, even if you're careful. Days passed, and there was still no sign of him. The rangers told us they'd found his backpack and water bottle near a steep ravine about half a mile from where we'd last seen him. That didn't make sense to any of us. He wasn't the type to leave the trail, especially not in that direction. The slope there was sharp and covered in thick brush. If he had slipped, it would have been nearly impossible for anyone to see or hear him from the trail above. I went back to that area with a ranger on the third day of the search. Standing near the edge of that ravine, I realized how easy it would be to fall without making a sound. The drop wasn't huge, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but it was hidden. The brush grew dense along the edge, and from the trail it looked like solid ground. One misplaced step would send you down the slope before you even had a chance to react. When they eventually found him 2 weeks later, it was exactly what everyone had feared. His body was wedged under a fallen tree, about 30 feet down the ravine. They said it looked like he'd slipped, tumbled, and gotten trapped beneath the trunk. He'd likely been knocked unconscious instantly. From where we'd been standing that day, only a few yards away, he was invisible, completely hidden by the angle of the slope and the overgrowth. The forest had swallowed him quietly, without a single sound reaching us. That thought still haunts me. I keep replaying that moment, how close we were, how easily it happened. One small decision, one careless step, and he was gone. I think about how we stood there calling his name while he was just a few yards below, motionless. The idea that we were that close enough to save him if we'd known where to look, is something I can't shake. After the search ended and everyone went home, I found it hard to hike again. Every trail started to look different, less peaceful and more dangerous in ways I hadn't noticed before. The forest didn't feel alive anymore. It felt indifferent, almost hostile. The same quiet that used to calm me now made my stomach twist. Whenever I hear branches snap in the distance, I think about how silent his fall must have been, how the woods can hide something so completely, even when it's right there. Months later, I went back once more, alone. I stopped at that same intersection, the place where we'd waited for him. Everything looked the same, the trail, the fallen log, the curve of the path leading uphill. The forest doesn't remember what happens in it. It just goes on. But standing there, I could still feel that moment hanging in the air. The air felt heavy again, humid, thick with the smell of earth and leaves. I realized then that what scares me most isn't the wilderness itself, but how quietly things can go wrong in it. How a person can disappear in a place that seems so open, how you can be just a few yards away and never know. It taught me that nature doesn't care about your plans, your safety, or how close your friends are. It doesn't warn you when something's about to happen. It just takes what it takes, silently, without a sound. Every time I think about the Smoky Mountains now, I don't picture the view or the sunlight breaking through the trees. I picture that quiet stretch of trail where we stopped, the one where we thought we were all together, when, without realizing it, we were already one person short. It was late summer when that hike happened, one of those weekends where the weather couldn't make up its mind between hot and cool. The air smelled thick with pine and dry soil, and everything in the woods carried that heavy, slow feeling that comes before autumn. There were 4 of us, me and 3 close friends, wandering off trail somewhere in the mountains outside of town. We weren't serious hikers. It was more like we wanted a place to hang out where no one would bother us. We carried a small cooler, a few snacks, and a couple of joints. It was supposed to be just a quiet day out there. We parked off a dirt road that barely fit 1 car width. The trail wasn't even marked. It looked like an old service path that hadn't been used in years, narrow and winding through dense trees. We walked for what felt like an hour, climbing gradually, and the further we went, the quieter everything got. The air started to cool, and there was this dry rustle to the wind that moved through the tall grass. Every now and then we heard something shifting far off, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but out there it could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even another hiker. The woods had that strange kind of silence where it wasn't completely quiet, but every sound stood out on its own. The crunch of your shoes, the buzz of a fly, the whisper of the wind, they all sounded louder than normal. The higher we climbed, the thicker the trees grew. They crowded in around us, trunks close together and bark darkened from years of rain. The ground was soft with pine needles and scattered rocks. Every step kicked up that old, earthy smell that's part dirt, part decaying wood. Eventually, we came across this small clearing, not open enough to see the sky clearly, but wide enough to feel like a natural place to stop. What stood out right away was this rough circle formed by large boulders and a downed tree that stretched across one side like a seat. It didn't look natural. The rocks were big and evenly spaced, like someone had placed them there a long time ago. Moss covered most of them, and there were carvings, nothing clear, just lines or shapes worn away by weather. The tree that had fallen looked as if it had been dragged there. The bark was stripped from one side, and it had deep grooves across it like it had been clawed or cut. We decided that would be our spot. It was quiet, a little hidden, and had a kind of eerie charm that comes with places that seem forgotten. We dropped our backpacks, sat down around the circle, and lit up. Smoke hung low and slow in the air, the kind that just drifts and settles into the damp smell of the forest. The light that filtered through the trees was gold and green, flickering with the movement of leaves. Time slipped by, the air cooled a little more, and the shadows stretched longer across the ground. I remember leaning back against one of the boulders, just staring up through the canopy. The sound of wind moving through the leaves started to drown everything else out. For a moment, I zoned out completely, eyes open but mind blank, until I realized something felt off. It was like the woods had stopped breathing. The air went still. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no buzzing insects. Even the background hum that always seems to exist in nature gone. I didn't notice it right away, but when I did, the silence hit hard. I could almost hear my own heartbeat. I remember looking at my friends. They hadn't said a word either, just sitting still, all of us caught in that weird, heavy quiet. Then, from somewhere behind me, deep enough in the trees that it sounded distant but clear, there was movement, fast movement, not like a deer bounding through the brush, but more like a person running. It was quick, rhythmic, the sound of feet hitting uneven ground. I turned my head slowly, eyes trying to adjust through the gaps in the trees. The sound stopped. I scanned the dark spaces between trunks, waiting for anything to move again. That's when I saw him. A man stepped out from behind a cluster of trees, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I can still picture it perfectly. He wasn't carrying anything, not even shoes. His body was thin but not frail, lean like someone who lived off constant movement. His skin was darkened by the sun, rough and dirty, and he was wearing nothing but animal skins, real ones, sewn together in rough patches that barely covered him. It wasn't like a costume. It looked handmade, crude, tied with raw strips of leather. His hair was long and matted, falling over his face. For a few seconds, he just stood there. He didn't say a word. He didn't make a sound. He just stared at us, or maybe through us. His eyes were wide, blank but alert, like an animal that doesn't know whether to fight or flee. The air felt heavy again, and that silence was so thick it made everything else feel unreal. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted.
No hesitaste.
He ran hard, straight back into the trees, his feet pounding through the undergrowth. The sound of him crashing through brush echoed for a few seconds, then faded completely. The forest went back to that deep, still quiet. None of us moved for what felt like a long time. I remember staring at the spot where he'd been, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My brain kept trying to find an explanation. Maybe he was some kind of off-grid survivalist, maybe a hunter, maybe someone who just lost his mind out here. But the way he appeared out of nowhere, the way he looked, it didn't fit neatly into anything. We eventually decided to leave. We didn't say a thing, just gathered our stuff and started heading back the way we came, walking faster than before, glancing over our shoulders every few minutes. I remember my chest tightening with every sound I heard. A branch breaking, leaves shifting, wind moving through the canopy again. The silence had lifted, but now every noise sounded suspicious. The trail back felt twice as long. The shadows grew darker as the sun dipped lower, and by the time we reached the car, the sky was turning orange and blue. We got in and drove off without looking back. No one said anything until we were halfway down the mountain road, and even then, it was just short sentences that didn't really explain anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man again. His skin, his hair, the way he stared. The woods around our spot played over and over in my head, that circle of rocks, that stripped tree. I couldn't stop thinking about how silent everything had gone right before he appeared, like the forest itself had frozen. A few days later, I tried to look up if there were any reports of missing people, hermits, or survivalists living in that area. I found a few mentions online of people who claimed to have seen mountain men or reclusive hunters living off the land. Some said they'd come across abandoned shelters made of branches, animal hides, and bones. Others said they'd seen smoke from campfires high up in the ridges, where no trails went. I don't know if what we saw was one of them or something else. All I know is that it was real. He was real. He came out of nowhere and disappeared the same way. Months later, when the leaves had fallen and the cold started creeping in, I went back there, alone this time. I told myself it was just to see if the place even existed the way I remembered it. I parked in the same spot, followed the same path, and eventually found that clearing again. The circle of rocks was still there, though it looked different. A few of the boulders had been moved, and the fallen tree was gone. Nothing left but a long patch of disturbed soil. There were bones scattered near the edge of the clearing. Animal bones, small and bleached white. Felt wrong to stay there. The woods were quiet again, not dead quiet like before, but enough to make my skin crawl. I stood there for maybe a minute, staring at that circle, then turned around and walked out as fast as I could. I never went back after that. I don't go deep into any forest anymore. Not like that. I think about that man sometimes, the way he looked at us, the way he ran. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he was protecting something. Maybe he'd been living out there for years, hidden from everyone, surviving on instinct and solitude. Whatever the reason, he didn't belong to our world anymore. And for that brief moment, standing in those woods, I realized how easy it is to cross that invisible line between civilization and the wild, how thin it really is. That was the day I met the man of the mountain, and I'll never forget how close I came to him before he vanished back into the trees. I remember that day so clearly because it started out so normal. I had been hiking alone for years and had done plenty of desert trails before. I liked the silence, the space, the feeling of being completely away from everything. That summer, I took a trip through southern Utah, planning to hit a few trails in one of the national parks before heading home. It was mid-July and the heat was already unbearable by mid-morning, but I checked the forecast, packed plenty of water, and left early to beat the worst of it. I thought I was prepared. I really did. The plan was simple. Start on one marked trail in the morning, follow it through a canyon, then connect to another loop that led back to the trailhead by late afternoon. My GPS watch showed a possible shortcut that would shave off about 2 miles by cutting through a narrow section between two canyons. The map made it look straightforward, a direct path that curved slightly and rejoined the main route. I remember looking at it and thinking it would be fine. I'd done similar shortcuts before without any trouble. The first few hours went smoothly. The landscape was wide and open, the kind of dry beauty that makes everything shimmer in the heat. The ground was hard-packed red sand, scattered with small rocks and brittle desert plants that seemed to grow out of nowhere. The canyon walls were tall and layered, each stratum a different shade of red and brown, like history carved into the earth. The air was bone-dry, and even with my hat and long sleeves, I could feel the sun pressing down hard. I drank often, small sips every few minutes, careful not to waste too much. When I reached the point where the GPS suggested turning off, the shortcut looked harmless, just a shallow wash between two large rock formations. I stepped off the main trail and followed the faint line of sand that wound between the canyon walls. There were no markers, but that wasn't unusual in the desert. Sometimes trails disappeared for a bit, then reappeared around a bend. I kept my GPS screen in view, watching the small arrow shift as I walked. First, it was easy. The path was open, the footing solid. The heat, though, was becoming brutal. The air felt like it was burning my lungs every time I took a breath. My shirt was soaked with sweat, but it dried almost instantly under the sun. The rocks reflected the heat upward, and I could feel it radiating from the ground. It was the kind of dry heat that sneaks up on you, the kind that makes you think you're fine until suddenly you're not. I walked for another half hour before realizing something was off. The GPS marker on my screen started bouncing, shifting slightly even when I stood still. The canyon walls had grown higher on both sides, narrowing the sky to a thin strip above. The signal wasn't stable anymore. The line that was supposed to represent my path had turned jagged, uncertain. I tried to recalibrate it, but it didn't help. Still, I wasn't worried yet. I figured if I kept moving in the general direction it showed, I'd hit the connecting trail soon enough. But the canyon kept twisting. Each bend looked like the last. Same rock faces, same patches of sand, same small plants clinging to cracks in the stone. I started marking my way by stacking small stones at turns, just in case. The air inside the canyon was stifling, with no breeze to move it. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. When I reached for my water bottle, I was surprised by how light it felt. I had already gone through more than half of what I brought. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps. That was when the panic started to creep in. The markers I'd made all looked the same, and the canyon had branches I hadn't noticed before. Narrow splits that curved in unpredictable ways. My GPS was still flickering, the arrow spinning slightly every time I moved. The main trail was supposed to be west, but the walls made it impossible to walk in a straight line. I picked what I thought was the right direction and started moving again, but every turn led me deeper into the maze. The sound of my footsteps echoed faintly, the only thing breaking the silence. I tried to stay calm, focusing on small steps, one bend at a time. But the sun kept moving higher, and the light grew harsher. The rock around me looked almost white from the glare. My skin burned even through my clothes. I found a sliver of shade near a wall and sat down for a while, breathing slowly, trying to think. My water was nearly gone. I forced myself to take one small sip, just enough to wet my mouth, and then I screwed the cap on tight again. I got up and started walking again, slower now. The canyon floor sloped slightly downward, and I followed it, hoping it might lead to a wider opening or a visible landmark. Instead, it funneled me into another dead end. Just more rock, higher walls, and the same dry, endless heat. I climbed partway up a ledge, hoping to get a better view, but all I could see were more canyon splits weaving into each other like veins. It was as if the landscape was designed to trick the eye, repeating itself endlessly. As the hours dragged on, I started to feel the heat in my head, a deep, dull throb that pulsed behind my eyes. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. Every movement made my heart race. I began to understand how easily people died out there, how quickly the desert stripped away confidence and reason. I told myself I was close, that the main trail had to be just ahead, but the thought sounded hollow in my head. The light began to shift, the sun lowering toward the ridges, but the temperature stayed brutal. When the first real sign of exhaustion hit, it wasn't dramatic, just a sudden weakness, like my legs didn't belong to me anymore. I stopped again, leaning against a rock. My body felt hollow, drained. I looked around and realized I couldn't tell which way I had come from anymore. The walls all looked identical, smooth and red, marked only by faint shadows that moved with the sun. I was alone in a maze that didn't want to give up its secrets. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there, listening to the sound of the wind moving faintly through the canyon above. The temperature dropped fast, and the sweat on my skin turned cold. The stars were visible as a thin line above the walls, distant and indifferent. I thought about walking through the night, but I knew it was too dangerous without light. I rationed the last few drops of water, holding the bottle up and letting them slide into my mouth slowly. It didn't help much. When morning came, I started moving again, slower than before. I felt dizzy, disoriented. The GPS had died overnight. I followed the sun's position, trying to keep west, thinking that eventually I'd have to hit the main trail again. Every step hurt. My throat burned. My lips were cracked and bleeding. My thoughts began to blur. Images of water, of shade, of the car waiting back at the trailhead. I remember seeing shapes in the rock that looked like faces, thinking they were watching me. I knew that was just my mind playing tricks, but it didn't stop the fear. At some point, I found a smooth section of rock beside me, pale and flat. I took out my knife and began carving into it, just something to leave behind, a record, I guess, of what had happened. I wrote the words slowly, pressing the blade into the surface. I thought I knew where I was. It felt true in a way nothing else did at that point. I thought I understood the desert, the maps, the trails. I thought I was in control. I wasn't. I remember sitting beside that rock for a long time, too weak to stand. I could see a sliver of the sky, bright and colorless, and I remember thinking the trail had to be close, maybe just beyond the next ridge. But I couldn't move anymore. My body wouldn't listen. They told me later that when they found me, I was less than half a mile from the main trail. If I'd taken one more canyon over, they might have seen me sooner. But I was hidden by the way the rock split, one wrong turn that led to a dead end. The message I carved into the rock was still there when they reached me. What stays with me most isn't the pain or the thirst or even the fear. It's the realization of how quiet it all was. How the desert doesn't warn you, doesn't care how prepared you think you are. You can be right there, just a few steps from safety, and never know it. All it takes is one bad decision, one shortcut you think will save you time, and the land reminds you how small you really are. That day started off like any other hike I'd done before. I was alone, deep in Arizona's Tonto National Forest, walking along a dusty trail that followed the edge of a narrow canyon. It was early afternoon, hot enough that the air shimmered above the rocks, but not unbearable yet. The sky was a flat blue, the kind that seemed endless, and the sun beat down with that dry desert heat that drains you slowly without you realizing it. I had been hiking for a few hours, pacing myself, sipping water from my pack, and planning to rest once I reached the small creek that ran through the canyon floor. I'd done this kind of hike many times before. Solo, quiet, the kind of escape I needed from crowded city life. The trail wasn't popular. That was the whole reason I chose it. Just rocks, scrub, and the sound of wind brushing through dry grass. Every step kicked up a puff of dust, and the silence stretched out for miles. The only sounds were my boots and the faint hum of insects that seemed to vanish the second I stopped moving. By the time I reached the creek, the sun was high and I was drenched in sweat. The water shimmered in the light, narrow and slow-moving, barely a few inches deep in some places. I dropped my pack beside a large rock and crouched near the water's edge to fill my bottle. The air felt cooler there, a small relief from the heat, and I sat down with my legs stretched out in front of me, just letting myself rest. That's when it happened, quick, almost too fast to understand. A sharp, burning pain shot through my right calf. It wasn't like a cramp or a scrape. It felt like someone had jammed a needle into my leg and twisted it. I jerked backward instinctively, looking down, and saw it. A rattlesnake coiled just a few feet from me, half hidden in the grass near the rock. Its tail rattled once, the sound harsh and dry. Then it slithered off toward the brush, leaving 2 small puncture wounds in my skin that were already starting to swell. For a second, I just stared. My mind couldn't process what had happened. Then the realization hit, fast and cold. I'd been bitten by a rattlesnake. The panic came hard after that. My heart started pounding. My breathing quickened. I knew enough about snake bites to understand that panicking would only make it worse, but telling yourself to stay calm is one thing. Actually doing it when your leg is burning and swelling is another. I scrambled to my pack and grabbed the small first aid kit I always carried. I had no snakebite kit, those suction things don't actually work, and I knew that, but I sat down trying to think clearly. The bite marks were small, clean, and already surrounded by red skin that was turning darker. The pain was spreading fast, a deep ache that pulsed up my calf. I felt lightheaded just looking at it. I checked my phone. Full battery, strong signal bar, but no service. The trail was too deep in the canyon for a connection. I thought about using the SOS feature, but I wasn't sure if it would work without service. I cursed myself for hiking alone, for thinking I didn't need anyone else. The next nearest person I knew of was 7 miles away, a couple I'd passed earlier that morning who were heading in the opposite direction. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The only chance I had was to start moving toward higher ground and hope to find service or another hiker. The sun was brutal now, reflecting off the rocks, baking the ground beneath me. I tied my bandana above the bite, not tight enough to stop blood flow, just enough to slow the venom, and started walking. At first, I thought I was doing okay. My leg hurt, but I could still move. Every step sent a wave of pain up through my thigh, but I told myself to just keep going. One step, then another. I followed the creek for a while before the trail started to rise, winding upward through loose rocks and dry brush. The landscape was empty, just stretches of tan and red earth, cliffs rising on both sides, and the low hum of the wind. After maybe 20 minutes, my head started to feel strange, dizzy, like the ground was tilting slightly under me. My calf was swollen badly now, the skin tight and discolored. The pain had changed from a sharp sting to a deep, throbbing pulse that made it hard to focus. I took a drink of water, but it didn't help much. The taste of dust was thick in my mouth. As I climbed, the dizziness worsened. I started to see flashes of light at the corners of my eyes. My breathing came fast, shallow. I had to stop every few minutes just to steady myself. I remember looking around and realizing how completely silent everything was. No birds, no insects. Just the faint buzz of my own pulse in my ears. It was like the desert was holding its breath. I tried calling out once, just to break the silence, but my voice came out cracked and dry. The heat was relentless. Sweat stung my eyes, and the air felt heavy, almost solid. I could feel the venom working its way upward, the muscles in my leg twitching uncontrollably. At some point, I started to lose track of time. The trail blurred. My vision dimmed at the edges. I remember thinking that if I could just reach the ridge ahead, I might get cell service. It didn't look far, maybe half a mile, but every step took everything I had left. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I tried to keep count of my breaths, anything to keep my mind focused. Then the ground shifted under me. I stumbled once, caught myself, then stumbled again. My head spun, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground, my pack digging into my side, the sun burning into my face. I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt like they didn't belong to me. My mouth was dry as sand. I don't remember falling asleep exactly, just fading in and out, the world going dim, the sound of my heartbeat loud and uneven. The next thing I remember clearly is voices, distant at first, muffled like they were underwater. Then footsteps crunching on gravel. I tried to move, to call out, but I couldn't get any sound out. I felt hands on my shoulders, then someone checking my pulse, lifting my leg. The light changed, shadows moving across my face. I remember the sound of a radio crackling, words I couldn't understand, and the faint hum of helicopter blades in the distance. When I woke again, it was dark, and I was in a hospital bed. My leg was bandaged, elevated, connected to 4 lines and monitors. The air smelled like disinfectant and plastic. My mouth was dry, and my body felt heavy. A doctor came by later and told me I'd been lucky, extremely lucky. Two off-duty firefighters had been hiking a different trail nearby and decided to explore a side route. They found me hours after I'd collapsed, half-conscious, dehydrated, and already in shock. They radioed for a rescue helicopter, and I was airlifted out. The doctor said if they'd found me 30 minutes later, I wouldn't have made it. The venom had already spread through most of my system. I spent 5 days in the hospital recovering, hooked up to antivenom and fluids, my legs swollen and bruised almost black by the time I woke. The pain didn't go away for weeks. When I was finally discharged, I went back home, but something about that day stuck with me. It wasn't just the fear or the pain, it was how quickly it all happened. One moment I was sitting by a creek, tired but calm, and the next I was fighting for my life in the middle of nowhere. I'd always thought I understood the risks of hiking alone, but that day proved how little control you really have out there. Now, whenever I hike, I can't sit down near a creek or a pile of rocks without checking everything around me first. I watch every step, every patch of brush. I don't move without letting the sound of my boots announce my presence. And I never hike without a satellite beacon anymore. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, it just waits. That bite, those few seconds of not paying attention, almost ended everything. What haunts me most isn't the pain or even the fear of dying out there. It's how quiet it was after the bite. How empty the world felt when I realized no one could hear me. The desert didn't change, didn't react. It just stayed still under the sun, indifferent. I thought I had time. I thought I was safe. But in places like that, time and safety mean nothing. They disappear as fast as the sound of a rattlesnake in the grass. I'd been climbing mountains for years before Granite Peak. I'd done the Tetons, Rainier, even Denali on a guided expedition. I wasn't reckless, at least I didn't think I was. But that trip to Montana was supposed to be a simple solo climb. Nothing record-breaking, nothing extreme. Just me, the mountain, and the quiet. Granite Peak had been on my list for a while. It wasn't the tallest mountain in the country, but it was one of the hardest in the lower 48. Steep, exposed, and unpredictable. I'd done my research, watched route videos, studied maps. I planned it for early fall when the weather was usually stable. I checked the forecast that morning before leaving camp. It mentioned possible storms late the next day, but that didn't worry me. Forecasts shift all the time in the mountains, and I'd pushed through bad weather before. I thought I could handle it. I started before sunrise, the air sharp and clean. The sky was a pale gray, streaked with pink as the sun came up. My breath hung in the cold air. The rocks were slick with frost but manageable. I felt good, strong legs, steady rhythm, heart beating easy. The climb was quiet except for the crunch of my boots and the occasional scrape of metal when I used my ice axe for balance. The route was rugged and steep, but beautiful in its own way. The higher I went, the smaller everything below looked. The trees, the valleys, even the sky felt farther away. I liked that feeling, being alone with nothing but the wind and the sound of my own breathing. Solitude has always calmed me. By late morning, clouds started to build on the horizon. Dark, thick ones. I told myself it was fine. Mountain weather always looked worse from a distance. But as I climbed, the light changed. The sky dimmed, and the wind picked up, sharp and cold. I checked my watch. It was earlier than expected for a storm. I had a choice, turn back or push for the summit before it broke. I chose to keep going. I remember the first flakes of snow, small, fast, almost like dust. They fell sideways, whipped by the wind. My gloves were damp from sweat, and I could feel the chill setting into my fingers. I zipped my jacket higher and pressed on. The summit ridge was close. I could see the faint outline through the fog, maybe 200 feet above me. But the storm moved faster than I did. Within minutes, the mountain changed completely. The wind roared like a jet engine. Snow came in sheets, stinging my face, clogging my goggles. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see my boots. Every sound was swallowed by the wind. It was like being inside a white tunnel with no direction. No sky, no ground. I tried to stay calm, to focus on one step at a time, but the cold was relentless. The temperature plummeted fast. My fingers started to stiffen. I flexed them inside my gloves, trying to keep circulation, but it wasn't helping. My breathing turned ragged as I fought through the wind. I tried to find a place to wait it out, some ledge or crevice to shelter in, but everything around me looked the same: snow, rock, and emptiness. At one point, I slipped. My crampons lost grip on an icy patch, and I went down hard on my side. The axe caught in the snow just enough to stop me from sliding down the slope. My heart hammered in my chest. I stayed still for a minute, breathing fast, realizing how close that had been. I crawled toward a rock outcrop that jutted from the slope and wedged myself behind it. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it broke the wind a little. That's where I stayed. The storm swallowed everything. The snow piled against my legs, numbing me to the bone. I kept telling myself it would pass, that it couldn't last forever. I tried to check my watch, but my fingers barely moved. My gloves were frozen stiff, coated in ice. I pressed my hands under my arms, trying to warm them, but the cold had already taken hold. The hours blurred together. The wind screamed through the cracks in the rock, a low, endless howl. It wasn't a sound you could get used to. It got into your head, filling every space with noise until you couldn't think straight. I closed my eyes and pressed my face into my jacket to block it out, but it was useless. The cold found every gap, every weakness. My body started to shake uncontrollably, not from fear but from the cold. That's the last thing you want. Shivering that violent means you're losing control. I tried to move my fingers again and couldn't. They felt like blocks of wood attached to my hands. I remember looking down and realizing I couldn't even feel my toes anymore. My boots were covered in snow, and the ice had sealed around the laces. At some point, night came. I couldn't tell exactly when because the storm made it dark long before sunset. I only knew because the faint gray light disappeared completely, replaced by a deep, crushing blackness. The wind didn't stop. It just changed tone, lower and heavier, like the mountain itself was breathing. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't even rest properly. Every part of me hurt. My face burned from the cold, and my joints locked up. I drifted in and out of awareness, my mind half frozen, body trembling. The snow pressed in around me, and I remember thinking that if it covered me completely, no one would ever find me. Time lost all meaning. I counted minutes, then stopped because it didn't matter. My thoughts came in flashes, memories of other climbs, of warmth, of sunlight. Then they'd fade, replaced by the sound of wind scraping over rock. I must have been there for hours before the storm finally eased. The wind slowed to a whistle instead of a roar. The snow settled. The silence that followed was worse somehow, heavy and absolute. I could barely move by then. My hands were blackened at the fingertips, hard as ice. My legs didn't respond right. I knew I couldn't climb down alone. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because when I woke up again, it was daylight, and I could hear distant voices through the wind. Rescue teams had found me. They told me later I'd been there for about 14 hours, clinging to that ledge, barely conscious, half buried in snow. The frostbite took most of my fingers and toes. The doctors said it was a miracle I was even alive. I stayed in the hospital for weeks, watching the blackened skin on my hands slowly peel away, replaced with bandages. My body healed, but something in me didn't. People called it bad luck, a storm that came earlier than predicted. But I knew it wasn't just that. It was my decision, my pride, thinking I could push through when I should have turned back. I replayed that moment 1,000 times, the point where I saw the clouds and kept climbing anyway. What I remember most isn't the pain or the cold. It's the sound. The wind wasn't just noise, it was alive in a way. It pressed against me from every direction, whispering through the cracks, roaring across the rock. It made me feel small, like I didn't belong there. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. That endless rushing, that deep, low sound of the mountain breathing. It's not a ghost story or anything supernatural. It's just nature, vast, indifferent, and powerful enough to remind you how fragile you really are. The mountain didn't want me gone. It didn't care whether I stayed or died. It was just being what it always was, wild, cold, and silent. But when you're alone up there, fighting for every breath, it feels personal. It feels like the world is reminding you that you're temporary. And that's a sound you never forget. I've been hiking and taking landscape photos for years, but nothing I'd done before ever compared to that trip near Yosemite, or the mistake I made that day. It was supposed to be just another weekend shoot, one of those quick, 2-day getaways where I could pack my camera, drive out before sunrise, and capture the mountain light as it poured through the valleys. I'd been out there dozens of times before, but this time, I decided to try a section of trail that was farther from the usual crowds. A remote ridge I'd read about in an old hiking forum. My friend Kyle came with me. He wasn't a photographer, but he liked hiking and didn't mind tagging along while I stopped every 10 minutes to set up shots. The trail we took wound through granite slopes, patches of pine, and stretches of loose, sandy dirt that slid under your boots if you didn't watch your footing. We started early in the day, and by late afternoon, we were near the top of a ridge with a clear view of the canyon below. The air up there had that thin, dry sharpness that you only get at elevation, where sound feels clearer and every movement echoes a little. I was exhausted, but the view was incredible. The cliffs stretched for miles, sharp gray and gold edges cutting against the sky. I wanted a wide shot of it, the kind of photo you could feel, so I edged closer to the rim where the granite dipped steeply down. The ground near the edge was uneven, loose rock mixed with patches of dust. Kyle stayed a few yards back, sitting on a flat boulder and drinking from his water bottle. I crouched to adjust my tripod, leaned forward to frame the shot, and shifted my weight just slightly to the right. That's when my left foot slipped. The ground beneath it crumbled, a sudden, sliding sound of gravel giving way. I tried to throw my weight backward, but there was nothing solid to grab. For a split second, I felt the sickening drop in my stomach, that moment of weightlessness before gravity takes hold. Then I went over the edge. The fall wasn't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet, but it felt endless. I hit the first ledge hard, my camera slamming into my chest, then bounced once and landed flat on my back. Pain exploded through my legs. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Then I heard my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I tried to sit up, but both of my legs screamed in pain. I looked down and saw that they were twisted at unnatural angles, one bent inward, the other already swelling through the fabric of my hiking pants. My backpack had ripped open, spilling out gear across the rocks. The camera had shattered, its lens cracked clean down the middle. Above me, I could see the lip of the ridge, a sheer wall of granite that rose about 25 feet. I knew Kyle was up there somewhere, probably trying to find a way down, but the cliff was too steep. I called out, my voice echoing against the canyon walls. I heard something faint in response, my name maybe, but it was hard to tell where it came from. The pain was constant, deep, and sharp. Every breath seemed to make it worse. I tried to crawl backward toward a flatter spot, but every movement sent shocks through both legs. Eventually, I stopped moving altogether and just lay there, staring up at the strip of blue sky. Time blurred after that. I remember the sunlight fading slowly, the way the rocks changed color as the shadows lengthened. The air grew colder, the warmth bleeding away as the sun dropped behind the mountains. I knew the temperature would plummet once darkness fell. I called out every few minutes, hoping someone would hear. At first, I thought I heard Cal shouting back, faint but clear. I yelled again, and the same sound came, a voice echoing from somewhere deep in the canyon. After a while, though, I couldn't tell if it was an answer or just my own voice bouncing off the rocks. The echoes came from all directions, overlapping in strange ways, making it impossible to tell what was real. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the rocks. I pulled my jacket tight and tried to stay as still as possible. I knew that if I moved too much, I'd lose heat faster. My legs felt heavy and numb, the pain dulling into something deeper, like my body was giving up on trying to register it. The stars came out one by one, bright and sharp against the dark sky. It was beautiful in a strange way, but terrifying too. Lying there, helpless, surrounded by the endless silence of the mountains, the night felt alive. Not in a supernatural sense, but in how massive and indifferent it was. The air, the stone, the wind, they didn't care if I made it through the night. Every so often, I thought I heard movement above me, rocks shifting or a voice. I'd call out, and the sound would bounce around until I couldn't tell if it had ever come from outside my own head. At some point, I stopped yelling altogether. My throat was dry, my lips cracked, and every breath came out in visible puffs. I focused on breathing slowly, counting the seconds, trying to keep my mind from slipping into panic. The cold got worse as the hours passed. My hands were stiff, my fingers almost useless. I tucked them under my arms to keep them warm, but it didn't help much. I could feel the tremors in my body slowing down, and that scared me. I knew what that meant. I forced myself to stay awake by focusing on the pain in my legs. It was the only thing that reminded me I was still alive. When the first light of morning touched the canyon, I felt an overwhelming mix of relief and exhaustion. I was still alive, but barely. The cold had seeped deep into my bones, and I could hardly move my arms. I must have drifted in and out of consciousness, because the next thing I remember was the sound of distant voices. Real ones this time. They came closer slowly, the sound of boots on rock echoing off the cliffs. Then I saw movement above me, figures lowering themselves down with ropes and helmets. Rescue workers. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out when they reached me. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My legs were wrapped in casts, and my body felt heavy, weak. The doctor told me both of my legs were broken, one in 2 places, but I'd been lucky. If I'd moved much during the night, or if I hadn't stayed still, I could have gone into shock or frozen to death. They told me it took the rescue team over 8 hours to reach me because of the terrain. Kyle had stayed near the ridge, calling for help and marking the spot as best he could, but he couldn't climb down to me. Later, one of the rescuers told me they heard me shouting when they first arrived at the ridge. Faintly but steady. They followed the sound of my voice to find me. But the strange thing was, when they tried calling back, their own shouts echoed around so much that it confused their sense of direction. They said it was almost impossible to tell where the voice was really coming from. Even now, months later, I can still remember that feeling. Lying there in the dark, calling out into the emptiness, and hearing the echoes fold back in on themselves. The canyon plays tricks on sound. Takes your voice and sends it back like it's someone else's. Sometimes I still hear it in my head when I think about that night. My own voice coming back at me from the dark, just slightly delayed, just unfamiliar enough to make me wonder if someone else was out there in the cold, calling too. I still hike, but I don't take chances anymore. I don't climb close to edges, and I never hike without a radio or satellite beacon. But no matter how careful I am, that memory lingers. The wind, the cold, and that endless echo that made me realize just how small a human voice really sounds when you're alone in the wilderness. It was early fall when I decided to take a solo hike through a section of the Appalachian Trail that ran through western North Carolina. The weather was cool, the leaves were just starting to change, and I'd been itching to spend a few quiet days in the woods. I had taken a few solo trips before, but this one felt different. I wanted to go farther than usual, deeper into the wilderness where I wouldn't see anyone for days. I planned everything carefully: maps, food, water filters, first aid, extra layers. I had checked the forecast 3 times, all clear. My pack was heavy but manageable. I drove out before sunrise, parked at a small gravel lot, and started walking just as the light broke through the trees. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine sap. The world was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of my boots on the dirt trail. For the first few miles, everything went smoothly. The trail twisted through thick forest and occasional clearings where you could see the ridges rolling out in layers. It was the kind of peace that makes you feel completely alone in the best way possible. I stopped for water near a stream, rested for a few minutes, then kept going. My plan was to hike until late afternoon and set up camp near a small meadow marked on the map. Around noon, I passed a section of the trail that looked less maintained. Leaves and fallen branches covered the path, and parts of it had washed out from rain. I didn't think much of it. The forest can reclaim a trail fast if it isn't used often. But something about that stretch felt different. The trees grew tighter together, their trunks twisted, and the air seemed still. Even the sound of birds had faded. I pushed through it anyway, keeping an eye on the faded white blazes painted on the trees. It wasn't until about an hour later that I realized I hadn't seen a single blaze in a while. I stopped, looked around, and felt that small stab of confusion that always comes before panic. The ground all looked the same, uneven patches of roots and fallen leaves. I turned around, walked back a few minutes, but couldn't find the last marker I'd seen. I pulled out my map and compass, but something didn't match. The terrain around me didn't seem to line up with the contours on the map. I knew I wasn't far off trail, maybe a few hundred yards at most, but in thick forest that can feel like miles. I tried to retrace my steps again, picking what I thought was the same direction I'd come from, but after 10 minutes, nothing looked familiar anymore. It's strange how quickly your mind changes when you realize you might be lost. One moment you're calm, logical, telling yourself it's fine, you'll find your way back. The next, every sound and shadow starts to feel threatening. The quiet that had felt peaceful earlier now felt heavy, pressing in from all directions. I forced myself to stop and think. The sun was still high enough that I could use it as a guide. I decided to head west, where the main trail should have been. I walked slowly, marking trees with small scratches as I went. After about half an hour, I thought I saw the faint outline of a footpath through the brush. Relief hit me hard. I followed it, convinced it would take me back. But the path didn't lead to the trail. It led to an open clearing, maybe 20 yards across, surrounded by trees on all sides. In the middle of it, there were signs of old human activity. A fire ring made of stones, a rusted camp chair half buried in leaves, and an old tarp torn and hanging from a low branch. Everything looked like it had been there for years. I walked closer, looking around carefully. The ashes in the fire pit were old and gray, scattered by wind and rain. The ground around it was littered with cans, bottles, and scraps of cloth. It wasn't uncommon to find old camps in the woods, but something about this one made my stomach turn. Maybe it was the silence, or the fact that there were no animal tracks, no signs of recent life. Just that feeling that I had walked into something forgotten and left to decay. I didn't stay long. I turned back the way I came and kept moving, trying to find the real trail again. By late afternoon, the light had started to fade, and I knew I had to set up camp soon. I picked a flat spot beneath a large pine, set up my tent, and built a small fire from dry sticks and pine needles. The warmth helped calm my nerves a little. As darkness settled, I sat by the fire eating a cold meal from my pack. The forest was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of the fire. I tried not to think about how I was off trail or how I might have wandered deeper than I realized. I told myself I'd wake up early, recheck my bearings, and find the trail in daylight. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had burned low, just faint red embers glowing in the dark. I lay there in silence, trying to figure out what had woken me. The forest was quiet, but I could feel something different, a heaviness in the air. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like something moving through leaves somewhere nearby. It wasn't fast or loud, just a soft shuffle every few seconds, stopping, then starting again. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came from behind my tent, maybe 20 feet away. I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but it sounded too deliberate. The steps paused, then started again, moving slowly around the tent. I stayed completely still, not daring to move. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound circled halfway around the camp, then stopped altogether. For a long time, there was nothing, no movement, no wind, no sound except my own breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep again without realizing it. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the trees. The forest looked calm and ordinary, as if the night had been a dream. But when I stepped outside the tent, I saw something that froze me in place. The layer of pine needles around my tent had been disturbed. Clear footprints led from the edge of the clearing right up to where I'd been sleeping. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, large and distinct, pressed deep into the soft earth. They stopped a few feet from my tent, circled once, and then disappeared back into the trees. I scanned the woods, half expecting to see someone still out there watching, but the forest was empty. The prints looked fresh, maybe from the night before. I packed up quickly, barely stopping to eat. I moved fast, trying to head downhill in the direction I thought the main trail was. After a couple of hours of hiking, I finally spotted a marker on a tree, a faded white blaze. Relief hit me like a wave. I followed the trail until it met another, more maintained path, and from there I knew I was close to where I had started. When I finally made it back to my truck, I felt an overwhelming mix of exhaustion and gratitude. I didn't stop until I was well out of the forest and back on the main road. Later that night, as I replayed everything in my mind, I realized how close I might have been to real danger. I had assumed I was alone out there, but those footprints proved otherwise. Whoever had been walking near my camp that night had gotten close enough to circle me, to stand only a few feet away while I slept. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the wind or imagination. Someone else had been there, watching quietly, moving carefully, waiting until the dark swallowed every bit of sound between the trees. I don't camp off-trail anymore. I still hike, but I stick to marked paths, places where I know I'm not completely alone. Because sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't getting lost or hearing strange noises. It's realizing that you were never really alone in the first place, and that someone else was out there, close enough to touch, long before you ever heard them move.